Welcome to Project Catalyst, an economic development podcast. I'm Tina Emerson, and today I am here with my co-host, David Spratley. He is an economic development director here at Maynard Nexsen. And we are joined today by Chris Chung, who is the CEO of the Economic Development Partnership of North Carolina. Since he took on that role in 2015, the EDPNC has helped North Carolina win more than 1,100 recruitment and expansion projects, resulting in 170,000 new jobs and $55 billion in announced new investments across the state. And you're both joining us from Raleigh today. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Well, Chris, I'm going to get started with you to get us rolling. And this is probably a very loaded question. What is the state of economic development right now in North Carolina?
Well, we're coming off of what we would consider to be a pretty solid year. And when I talk about that result, that's really a couple of the functions that we get a lot of attention for, which are really our efforts at a state level to attract new companies to locate here, as well as assist existing companies to expand here. Those are two of the metrics that people pay a lot of attention to relative to what EDPNC works on behalf of the state. And when I say it's a solid year, we're probably going to land somewhere in the neighborhood of called 120 announcements that result in somewhere near 11 or 12,000 jobs. It really a little bit depends on how much gets announced here by companies before the end of the year. But that's a very solid year by any definition. But it does happen to come after two record-setting years for North Carolina in terms of job creation and investment announcements. So obviously, it's hard to break records every single year. It's okay to have a solid year, but that's where things look like right now. A lot of what we would consider to be singles and doubles in terms of the wins that have announced so far in 2023. So projects creating somewhere between 200 and 600 jobs per announcement, somewhere from 100 to 500 million in investment. Those are wonderful projects. They can be very uplifting for the communities that land them. That said, 2021, 2022, we were fortunate to win a lot of projects that were more in the realm of thousands of new jobs and billions of new investment per announcement. So while the number of wins is pretty consistent, the size of each win has been a little bit on the relatively smaller size compared to the past couple of years in 2023. But by all definitions, still going to be a very good year in that regards for North Carolina.
Okay, well, let me take a second then and kind of dive a little bit deeper into that. Because you're right, it's been pretty remarkable, but what you and EDPNC have been able to do on the business recruitment side for, well, I guess since its inception, I believe that you've continued to increase project and job wins each year to a pretty remarkable level. And there's going to be a dip this year, but as you said, still a very strong year. I guess my question is, do you have a sense of what other states are seeing right now? Are you seeing similar dips in other states?
Yeah, so I was actually at an event earlier this week. I think, David, you're familiar with this one, but it's one that one of our major partners in the railroad industry. It's a conference that they convene every year for some of their key partners, including the state economic development industry. And so that was a great chance to talk to some of my peers in the states that we compete with every day across the Southeast. And I think we're all seeing the same thing, which are fewer of these blockbuster, multi-thousand job, multi-billion dollar investment deals that have announced in 2023, and a lot more of what we would have seen pre-pandemic, or at least prior to 2021, more in that realm of really great projects in that several hundred millions of dollars of investment or several hundred jobs. Again, wonderful projects by any right. It's just when you have a couple of years there where you're seeing lots of activity, lots of announcements that are thousands of jobs, billions of investment, when you move away from that, like in 2023, it can seem like a letdown, even though in any other normal year, it would be wonderful results. So I think we're all seeing that, just not a lot of those big blockbuster headline grabbing announcements, really for the vast part of 2023 for all of our competitive set.
Yeah, it's interesting as I talk to folks like you in other states as well. I get a sense, and I'm really looking for you to kind of either confirm or set me straight here. I get a sense that there's still a fair amount of activity out there project-wise and with some large projects. But I'm getting the sense that they're really just not pulling the trigger on any of these projects. So these projects are kind of stalling out. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, whether that's the reality, and if so, what your thoughts are on why that is.
I would say that's probably a correct assessment, that we certainly seeing the activity, right? If you slice open our current pipeline of activity, you certainly see a lot of projects that we are actively competing for that are in that range of 1,000+ jobs or 1 billion+ in new investment. So again, big projects, the likes of which we saw lots announced, not just in North Carolina, but across the Southeast in 21 and 22. As to why they may be taking a little bit longer to make those decisions, or maybe even in some cases postponing the project, I think some of that has to do with the industry sectors. As you know, David, from attending some of our board functions and hearing some of our communications, 1 out of every 7 of the projects that we're chasing today are in the automotive space. And most of that is vehicle electrification. So as the auto industry worldwide transitions to more battery electric vehicles, or at least hybrid electric vehicles, they're making a lot of investment in building up that production capacity, including right here in the United States. Well, the need for that production capacity is very much tied to demand for electric vehicles. So if that demand curve does not rise as quickly as maybe some of these companies anticipated, then the need to get that production capacity online as quickly as they were thinking, that also gets affected by the consumption side. So I think that's probably part of it. You certainly have federal policy, things like the Inflation Reduction Act. We're getting ready to go into a presidential election year. And while the IRA was passed by Congress and signed by President Biden, it's possible that another administration might take a different tack on IRA. Maybe a differently controlled Congress might do something to tweak, possibly even repeal IRA. It's really, again, nobody can read those tea leaves, but if those things are possible, you can imagine that might have a bit of at least a dampening effect on companies that are in sectors whose investments are being spurred by IRA in the first place. So I think all of these are probably conspiring to lengthen that decision timetable that we're seeing companies go through right now.
When you look at those industries, and you mentioned those different sectors and EV in particular, what other industries are you seeing that are showing a vested interest in North Carolina?
Yeah, so as I said, about 15% of our deal flow right now, and that's based on a sample size of about 250 active projects, and we've stayed pretty consistent at that volume of activity for at least the past couple of years now. Projects come into the pipeline, projects exit the pipeline, but we've held steady in that 230 to 260 range pretty much over the past 2.5 years. 15% of those deals are automotive related. Another 15% are in what we classify as the energy sector. And energy, of course, can mean lots of different applications. But for us, that's going to be things like the manufacturing of solar panels. It could be the development or production of hydrogen fuel cell systems. It could be components that go into wind power generation. It could even be things like utility scale battery storage. So not automotive EV batteries, but things like really designed for grid redundancy and all of that sort of thing. So all of those would be energy projects, and those are representative of the kinds of deals that we are competing for on the recruitment and expansion standpoint. So again, that's also 1 out of every 7 projects. So right there, 2 out of every 7, so close to a third of our deals are really coming out of what many people would call the clean energy economy or the green economy, whatever you call it. It's those sectors where we're seeing a lot of opportunities to attract jobs and investment. Food and beverage, also another sector that's consistently a bigger part of our pipeline. I think it's 1 out of every 10 deals right now is food, beverage, some sort of agribusiness company. And then I think 1 out of every 10, give or take, is in the life sciences sector. That would include gene therapy, biotechnology, biopharmaceutical manufacturing. And then, of course, the other whatever fraction is left after you add 1/7, 1/7, 1/10, and 1/10, whatever is left after that, that's just going to be a mix of things like aerospace or chemicals or plastics, but nowhere near the ratios that we're seeing with those other more dominant sectors right now.
Yeah, it is truly amazing to see kind of what electrification of things has done for, I guess, the evolution of job creation in North Carolina and across the Southeast. For that matter.
Yeah, I mean, you were with us until end of 2019, and I mean, we would see maybe, I'm not even sure if we saw any EV related stuff as recently as that. It's all just come on in the past 2-3 years.
Yeah, it truly is amazing to watch things transform that quickly. Talking about transformation, I guess that's somewhat of a good segue. You and I saw you earlier today at EDPNC's board meeting. We didn't have a chance to chat. But I did think it would be a good time to kind of zoom in on EDPNC, the organization itself. as it's solidly into its 10th year, approaching its 10th year anniversary. I guess it would be in October. And clearly that organization has grown up over the 10 years. You're solidly into, I guess what I would say, you're a young adult now. As you've led that organization for 8 of the 10 years, I'm curious to just take a second, pause, and get your reflections on kind of where things have come from.
Sure.
And quite frankly, more interesting to me is to take a quick peek into your crystal ball and tell us what you see in the future in the coming years for EDPNC, perhaps as opportunities or even challenges.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'll try to get all those. It might be a little bit of a longer answer, but I'll do my best to be efficient. As you pointed out, the organization, well, you know this because you were integral to the organization spinning out of the Department of Commerce and getting its legs underneath it for really the first almost 7 years of our existence. So the doors of the EDPNC opened in October of 2014. It was an act of legislation, basically allowed the state commerce agency to spin off a number of economic development roles into the management of a new nonprofit public-private organization. And that's how the EDPNC came about back in 2014. I had the privilege to join the team in January of 2015, so just a few months after it officially opened its doors. And for the listeners who may not be as familiar with the other parts of our mission beyond business recruitment and existing employer expansion, we also handle 3 other functions that are generally seen as very important to economic development in any state. For us, that includes international trade. So that's really helping our manufacturers to export more of their products around the world. It's counseling would-be entrepreneurs, providing them some technical assistance as they get ready to start a brand new business somewhere in North Carolina. And last but not least, tourism promotion. So getting leisure travelers to come here and spend their vacations, but more importantly, spend their disposable income on our communities that are home to our beaches, our mountains, our golf courses, all of those things that draw leisure travelers to come spend time here. That brings a very real economic impact to our state. And the tourism team, that includes things like film and TV production recruitment, retiree attraction, even amateur sports events, because think about what happens when you see your kids play in a youth sports tournament. You're traveling, you're staying in a hotel, you're dining at the local restaurant. All those things are part of the tourism economy, which has a great impact on our state. So we do those 5 things and have done those 5 things since 2014 when our doors opened as an organization. I think your first part of your question was give us a quick recap on how it's been over the almost 9 years now that I've been in this role. As you said, we're still young. I mean, the organization turns 10 next October. So I'm thinking about how I was as a 10-year-old and I still didn't know a whole lot, right? I mean, you've grown up some, but there's still plenty of room to develop and grow better. And I think that's where we find ourselves as we've had some really good results. Whether you look at our tourism team or our recruitment team or our trade team, I think we have proved that the model can be successful in North Carolina. That, of course, that's a result of not only having a great product called North Carolina, but all of the people that have been part of EDPNC at a board level, staff level, like yourself, David. Again, you I don't have to tell your listeners, you have a fantastic reputation in this industry here in North Carolina. All the people who got us to where we are 10 years into this, along with all our partners, our investors, like your current firm is, that's wonderful. For us, the key is, okay, now that we're 10 years old and we've proven we can do these things well on behalf of the state, what else should we be looking at over the next 10 years? What are other economic development roles or gaps that exist today where EDPNC, with its structure, with its resources, with its experience and relationships, are these gaps ones that EDPNC can play a role in solving? And I think that, as you saw from the board meeting, those are discussions we've just now started having with our board of directors as we look at the next chapter, the next decade for EDPNC. Of course, we have a governor's election coming up here in North Carolina next year. The current governor is capped out at the end of his second term next year. So there will be a new administration. We, of course, no idea who will end up being the next governor, but part of the next year, 15 months, is going to be building that relationship with the incoming administration to make sure that we are in sync with their economic agenda. Remember, we do this work as an extension of the executive branch and under contract with the state commerce department. So our priorities really need to mirror the priorities and agenda of whomever is running the executive branch. And of course, all in the background is we are also a creation of the legislature. So we have to make sure that we're meeting their needs as well. So all of those things are, of course, going to take up a lot of our thought process in the coming year. But you're going to have that, right? I mean, it's just, this is a function of how state government operates. But we're excited about that opportunity, whomever ends up in the governor's mansion. And hopefully we'll be able to continue delivering results for the people that we serve in North Carolina.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that evolution as well. Just let me go real specific on you. Product availability has been a challenge, I will say, in North Carolina, but not uniquely in North Carolina, in the Southeast and across the country for that matter. It's pretty impressive how the legislature in North Carolina has done a bit of a pivot and is taking a fairly active role in product development by appropriating some funds that go into originally the Mega Site Readiness Program and then the Select Site Program. Could you just take one quick second and just speak to those two programs for the listeners, especially those who may not be familiar with what they are?
Yeah, let me start by going back 10 plus years. And again, while I was not here in North Carolina at the time, I got plenty of education from folks like yourself, David, and a lot of our contemporaries in this business about the landscape, at least before EDPNC was on the scene. And that landscape was one where North Carolina certainly won a lot of really good deals, but one area of activity where it seemed to have some difficulty was landing those really big transformative economic development projects that we saw go to places like Alabama or Tennessee or South Carolina or Georgia. And that was oftentimes investments in the traditional automotive industry, so vehicle assembly plants. And that was a frequent question, I think, when I arrived almost 10 years ago, which is, when is North Carolina going to get an auto plant? What do we need to do to get an auto plant? And of course, a lot of my learning on the job was understanding, well, what were the bottlenecks for North Carolina in the past? And it really came down to two things. It was, one, we didn't necessarily have the kinds of large industrial sites that were very conducive for that kind of investment. And you got to have big parcels of land that are regular dimensions and relatively even topography, so there's not a lot of pitch and roll to them. Got to have heavy utilities. You got to be close to a workforce that can support 2,000, 3,000 employees. So you got to have the sites, the product, but you also have to have a willingness to do the kind of incentive package that is necessary to win those kinds of competitions. And I think other southern states had done a better job about getting their governors and legislatures on board with that kind of philosophy. And for whatever reason, those things hadn't quite gelled in North Carolina. I think EDPNC came about at a good time. There were already some efforts underway to address both of those. But I like to think that EDPNC has helped play a role by really focusing attention on those being two areas where the state's got to step up and make critical investments and be competitive. Otherwise, those opportunities would continue to pass us by in favor of our southern competitors. And I think that's probably one of the things I think EDPNC should be most proud of, is our ability to advance that conversation in a way that I think led to those key investments. And I think as a result, North Carolina's been very successful landing some of these big projects. But what that's done, ironically, is all the effort over the past 10 years to build up a good inventory of product, big sites that could accommodate a big economic development deal, a willingness to do incentives. That success by landing those very same projects has now actually temporarily depleted our inventory of sites that are ready to go. So now we're at this stage where we're finding ourselves with a little bit of a thinner cupboard than we would really like when it comes to those big industrial sites. As you said, we continue to compete for big projects that need that kind of site. And so what do we need to do as a state to invest in developing the next generation of mega sites so that we're never turning away company? Like, the last thing, David, we ever want is, you or one of your colleagues comes to EDPNC and says, we're representing client, they've got $2 billion of investment, 2,000 jobs, they need 1,000 acres, it's got a heavy utilities, and we have to say, stop right there, David, I'm sorry, we don't have anything that's going to be ready in the next 5 years. Like, that'd be a really bad position to find ourselves in. So how do we make sure we never get to that point? And the key is proactive investment in identifying these sites, which your firm helped us to do last year, and now setting aside meaningful funding towards getting each of those sites a little bit closer to market readiness, so that we're shortening the development timetable for a company that's interested in acquiring that site for their future use. It's not an easy process. It's not a cheap process, but there is clearly, as you said, a commitment to doing that among the governor and the legislature that probably wasn't there 10 years ago, may not have even been there a whole lot 5-6 years ago, but clearly there's an understanding now that we got to stay competitive, and that means a full cupboard of product that we're selling from.
Thank you, Chris. We're running out of time, but I do like to end on one great question for economic developers everywhere, particularly someone in your position. Let's hear your elevator pitch for North Carolina. That's a great way to stop.
I'm not being coy, but I'm not a proponent of a quote unquote elevator pitch, in the sense that I think any economic developer tries to understand what's important to that company, right? Because every single one of these companies, they're going to have things that are different to them in terms of their must-haves and their nice-to-haves and their want-to-haves. And for us to really tailor the pitch, we've got to sit down and first understand what is it that's really uniquely important to that company. Chances are we'll have it, but rather than sell first, it's better for us to understand first. That's always the philosophy. All that said, you can imagine the things that really heighten our attractiveness to companies are going to come down to things like talent. Our very fast growing population, which deepens the talent pool. It's a relatively younger working age population. That's also very interesting. We've got community colleges that play a key role in upskilling talent. We've got veterans who are leaving active duty military, re-entering the civilian life. That's another great tributary that feeds the talent pool. Tremendous amount of in-migration, people moving here from other states. You know, folks like David and myself were native-born Ohioans, but we made our way down here to North Carolina and wised up. So all of those things continue to feed our talent pool. Of course, very competitive when it comes to tax, regulatory, overall cost of business, energy costs. We passed some legislation as a state that only ensures reliable and competitively cost electricity, but also electricity that's increasingly be sourced from decarbonized or renewable sources. And that's very important for a lot of these manufacturers. So you put all those things together along with quality of life and all these other factors, and we have a very compelling story. It's just we have to listen to what those companies want before we go full bore as to what that pitch is going to look like.
Right. It sounds like a great sell for North Carolina and for the Southeast in general, right?
Well, I don't know about the Southeast. I'm not going to say anything nice about our competitors. I'm just talking North Carolina.
That's okay. You got to do your job. I understand. Thank you both, gentlemen, for being here today and for the great conversation. We could really go on and on. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we will see you next time on Project Catalyst. Thank you both very much for being here.